Hello everyone. My name is Fatma Ismail. I'm the Director for Outreach and Programs at RC. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce our distinguished speaker for today's lecture, Professor Fred H. Lawson. Professor Lawson is a professor of government emeritus at Mills College. Professor Lawson dedicated over 3 decades of his illustrious career to teaching at Mills College, where he inspired countless students with his extensive knowledge and passion for his subject matter. As the editor of the esteemed Syracuse University Press series, Intellectual and Political History of the Modern Middle East, he has played a pivotal role in shaping the academic discourse surrounding this critical region. A true ambassador of knowledge and culture exchange, Professor Lawson served as the Fulbright Lecturer in International Relations at the University of Aleppo during the academic year 1992 to 1993. Notably, he has become the first U.S. Fulbright Lecturer ever assigned to Aden University, where he shared his expertise in political science during the spring of 2001. Professor Lawson's influence extends beyond his classroom and lecture halls. He has assumed leadership positions as the president of both the Syrian Studies Association and the Society for Gulf Arab Studies, further solidifying his commitment to fostering a deeper understanding of the Middle East and its intricate dynamics. A prolific author, Professor Lawson has penned 5 highly acclaimed books, including Constructing International Relations in the Arab World, 2006, and Why Syria Goes to War, 1996. Moreover, he has made significant contributions as co-editor of the comprehensive 4-volume book, International Relations of the Middle East, in 2015. In recognition of his extensive and scholarly accomplishments, Professor Lawson's book, The Social Origins of Egyptian Expansion During Muhammad Ali's Period, 1992, was translated into Arabic by the prestigious Higher Council for Culture, commemorating the bicentennial of the Pasha's ascent to power in Cairo. Today, we gather here not only to honor Professor Lawson's outstanding achievements, but also to celebrate his unwavering commitment to RC through his generous estate gift to the organization in support of modern Egyptian studies. We are deeply grateful that Professor Lawson has chosen to honor his dedication to scholarship by entrusting RC with such an impactful gift. We are honored Professor Lawson has allowed RC to recognize him in this way, and it's certainly a treat for us all to hear his work on the critical topic he's going to talk about today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fred Lawson. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such a generous introduction. When we think about conflicts in the Middle East today, our minds turn quickly to the civil wars in Syria and Yemen, the fighting that's taking place in Libya, and the tensions in the Gulf between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Very little attention has been devoted to the explosive dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia over the distribution of the waters of the Nile River basin. This dispute has heated up at various times over the past 6 decades. The dispute flared once again in the spring of 2011 when the authorities in Addis Ababa started work on a mammoth developmental project called the Millennium Project. This Millennium Project clustered along the largest tributary of the Nile, the Blue Nile River. The Blue Nile provides more than 80% of the water of the Nile River as it flows down through Sudan and into Egypt. The centerpiece of the Millennium Project is a huge new dam that was initially called the Millennium Dam, but has later been rechristened the Grand Renaissance Dam. The Grand Renaissance Dam is about 1/3 as long as the High Dam at Aswan, but it's about 50% taller than that dam and will have a storage capacity just under half of the storage capacity of Lake Nasser. The stated purpose of the Grand Renaissance Dam is to increase electricity output, not only electricity for Ethiopia to use at home, but also electricity for Ethiopia to sell to surrounding countries and enable surrounding electrical grids to expand and become more stable. But not only will the dam provide hydroelectric power for electricity, it is also part of a massive infrastructure scheme that includes an extensive network of irrigation canals. And it's highly likely that water will also be siphoned off for agricultural purposes inside Ethiopia. Officials in Cairo were deeply concerned that the new dam and the accompanying irrigation works will sharply reduce the amount of water that flows northward from the highlands of Ethiopia through Sudan and on into Egypt. Nevertheless, during 2011 and 2012, officials in Cairo adopted a largely accommodative posture toward the new project and basically pushed for outside experts to be invited in to assess the impact of the project rather than objecting to the project in its entirety. The government in Addis Ababa acquiesced in this plan to bring in outside consultants, but at the same time moved ahead in surveying the area around the site of the dam and preparing the site of the dam for construction to begin. And the Ethiopian authorities generally ignored Egyptian proposals for how to deal with the project, and the Ethiopian authorities generally dragged their heels on supplying technical documents and other materials that might have allowed specialists to undertake technical feasibility studies. May of 2013 brought the unexpected news that Ethiopian engineers were going to divert the course of the Blue Nile River in order to start laying the foundation for the Grand Renaissance Dam. This news provoked an outburst of belligerence among Egyptian politicians. Some members of Egypt's Council of Representatives even called on the Egyptian government to take military action in order to defend Egypt's historic rights to the water of the Nile River. The bellicosity that was expressed by representatives in the Egyptian Chamber of Representatives was largely dampened by senior officials in the foreign ministry and by the office of the presidency that tried to keep Egypt's response moderate, to keep the crisis from spiraling out of control. And the crisis of the spring of 2013 generally subsided after Mohamed Morsi was removed from power in July of 2013. Shortly after he was elected to office the following year, in May of 2014, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi met with the Egyptian Prime Minister, met with the Ethiopian Prime Minister, Hailemariam Desalegn, at the summit meeting of the African Union. The two leaders in the spring of 2014 agreed to resume high-level negotiations over the future of the waters of the Nile River Basin. These talks culminated in March of 2015 in a Declaration of Principles, a formal document that lays out the objectives, lays out the primary concerns that the governments of Egypt, of Ethiopia, and of Sudan have concerning the Millennium Project and concerning the future of the Nile River. The Declaration of Principles was signed by the water ministers of Egypt, of Ethiopia, and of Sudan. And at the time, in March of 2015, this agreement was widely hailed as a major breakthrough, almost a solution to the problem of distributing the Nile River waters. The Declaration of Principles set the stage for a succession of high-level meetings involving the water ministers of the three countries, the foreign ministers of the three countries, and other senior government officials. During the course of these meetings, once again, it was decided that outside consultants would be invited in to assess the project and to give advice about the future of water distribution. But none of the meetings that took place after March of 2015 addressed the fundamental points in dispute, especially the points in dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia. Egypt has continued to insist that Egypt should receive about 2/3 of the annual flow of water coming down the Nile River. Ethiopia has kept up construction of the Grand Renaissance Dam, and Ethiopia has refused to consider any kind of joint operation, any kind of multilateral program with regard to the Millennium Project. And this lack of basic consensus of the basic principles involved in the dispute convinced the first consulting company to pull out and to no longer take part in advising and giving technical recommendations concerning the Millennium Project. When this consulting group pulled out, the representatives of Cairo, Khartoum, and Addis Ababa met in Cairo in November of 2015 to firm up the terms of contracts for consulting companies. But the representatives could not reach an agreement regarding the scope of the experts' activities. Egypt has demanded that all work on the dam, all construction work on the dam, should be stopped until the consultants have turned in their reports. Ethiopian officials have ignored this demand, but they have hinted that the reports might be taken into consideration at some point later on. And this basic disagreement about the role of the consultants and the timing of construction took shape at the end of 2015 and continues to drive the situation between these two countries even today. At the end of 2015, the very last weeks of the year, there was a further major interruption in the flow of the Blue Nile River as water was diverted back into its original channel so that the waters of the river could flow through the inlets in the lowest stage of the dam. And this step that Ethiopia took to divert the river once again back into its original channel directly contravened the terms of the Declaration of Principles. The Declaration of Principles mandated that Ethiopia should notify Egypt and notify Sudan if any major step were about to be taken in the construction process. And Ethiopian officials gave no advance warning that this interruption in the river was about to take place. Moreover, a few weeks later, in early 2016, Ethiopia announced that it would not take an Egyptian suggestion to increase the number of spillways going through the dam to ensure a steady flow of water in case there were some malfunction in the dam. The Ethiopians decided not to have backup spillways, not to have safety valves in case some problem arises with the main features of the dam. And around this same time as well, an Ethiopian technical expert reported that the initial filling of the lake behind the dam would involve 4 billion cubic meters of water for this initial filling, instead of the 3 billion cubic meters of water that had been initially announced. More important than the size of this first filling was that the Ethiopian engineers notified Egypt that the filling of the reservoir would be done in 3 or 4 years, not in 11 years, as the Egyptian government had suggested, had even demanded. By insisting on a much shorter time period to fill the dam, obviously more water will be taken out each year, with a higher potential for disrupting the flow of the river each year. In late November of 2016, unexpectedly, a delegation of Saudi officials from Saudi Arabia arrived in Ethiopia, and these Saudi representatives trekked from the capital out to the site of the Renaissance Dam, took a look at the project, were briefed on the project, and in effect gave their imprimatur, gave their permission for the project to go ahead. And the visit by these Saudi representatives, the intervention of Saudi Arabia into the dispute, elicited heated criticisms in the Egyptian press. What we see in all this is that the year 2016 looks like a kind of turning point. The year 2016 was a year in which the dispute escalated, the level of conflict and tension over the Millennium Project surged once again as 2016 went by. In response to this escalation of the dispute, in early January of 2017, the Egyptian Navy inaugurated a new command, a new part of the Egyptian Armed Forces, and designated this new command the Southern Fleet. And for the first time, the Egyptian government has permanently stationed warships in the Red Sea to patrol not only the Red Sea, but as far south as the Bab el-Mandeb, where the Red Sea empties into the Indian Ocean. The Southern Fleet looks like it's going to be a quite powerful naval force. It will be built around the French-made helicopter carrier Gamal Abdel Nasser, and will also include a Russian-made missile frigate, the Ahmed Fadil. And so 2 of the most powerful ships in the Egyptian Navy are now based in the Red Sea along the coast toward the southern end of military operations. The commander of the Egyptian Navy remarked at the time when this Southern Command was being set up that the new formation will, quote, offer a powerful shield against anyone who might venture to violate Egyptian territorial waters at a moment when the region is awash with threats and challenges to Egyptian national security. Threats from the south, threats regarding the Nile River were clearly on the mind of Egyptian military planners as of early 2017. In March of 2017, representatives from Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, and the other Nile riparian countries, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, all gathered together in the capital city of Uganda to work out a common position regarding the distribution of the Nile River and the management of the Nile River basin. During the course of this meeting, Egyptian representatives proposed that Egypt should be given the right to veto any projects that put Egypt's water allocation in jeopardy. That Egypt should be allowed to determine whether or not projects would go ahead. And intriguingly, this proposal was unanimously rejected by the other countries. The other countries of the Nile River no longer seem willing to accord Egypt a special position, to accord Egypt special rights concerning the waters of the Nile River. We don't quite know what might have happened in the wake of this meeting, because in February of 2018, a wave of popular protests swept across Ethiopia. And these popular protests overturned the sitting government in Addis Ababa and brought to power a new prime minister, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed very quickly pledged to cultivate national unity inside Ethiopia and set the stage for a truly open political order inside the country. And during the first weeks after he became prime minister, Abiy Ahmed raised questions about the value of the Millennium Project. It looked like Ethiopia might reconsider this massive infrastructure project, might even scale back some of the elements of the Millennium Project. But this move toward questioning the Millennium Project, reconsidering the future of the project, stopped abruptly when the head engineer for the dam was found killed in the streets outside his house, and a surge of popular fervor grew up in response to finding the dam project being put in jeopardy. And the government of Ethiopia recommitted itself to building the dam, its original conception, as a rallying point for national unity, a rallying point for national sovereignty for the Ethiopian nation. So negotiations dragged on. Ethiopian officials once again started meeting with Egyptian officials and Sudanese officials. The negotiations dragged on for a year or so. By the fall of 2017, it was clear that Egyptian officials were becoming impatient with the negotiations dragging on. In September of 2017, Egyptian officials finally took the dispute to the United Nations and addressed the United Nations General Assembly, hoping that perhaps the United Nations would be able to move talks along, towards settling the dispute. President Assisi addressed the UN General Assembly in September of 2009, and the president told the assembled delegates that, quote, "The Nile's water is a matter of life and an issue of existence for Egypt." So again, Egyptian officials unwilling to consider changing the allocation of water, unwilling to restructure the basic system whereby waters are allocated at the present time. The Egyptian government then appealed to the United States to step in and play some part in the dispute. And in response to this suggestion, American officials invited Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan to Washington in November of 2019 and tried to jumpstart negotiations, make negotiations more effective. The first meeting in Washington in November set the stage for 4 follow-up meetings. And during the course of these meetings, the focus of the discussions shifted subtly and shifted in the direction of what would happen to the allocation of Nile River water in the event of an extensive drought across the region. So not so much, how the water should be distributed in normal times, but more what emergency situations would mean for the way water were distributed among the 3 countries. Sudanese officials seem to be increasingly worried about the direction the talks were taking. And at the fourth and last meeting of these talks in Washington, the Ethiopian representatives pulled out and left the meeting, claiming that Ethiopia's delegation needed to have internal discussions to deal with the topics that were already on the table. In April of 2020, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced that the very first filling operation for the reservoir behind the dam would be undertaken during the rainy season of the summer of 2020. When Ethiopia announced that the reservoir were just about to start to be filled, Cairo immediately lodged a formal complaint with the United Nations Security Council, complaining that this was an abrogation of the Declaration of Principles and a major shift in the pattern of interactions, the historic pattern of interactions of distributing the river water. Ethiopia responded that by complaining to the Security Council, Egypt had infringed on Ethiopia's sovereignty. And the Ethiopian government started to install anti-aircraft missiles around the dam complex to protect it against any outside attack. At this point, the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, stepped in his role as chair of the African Union, and the South African president persuaded the three countries, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan, to resume talks under the auspices of the African Union. So you notice we now have a third outside mediator, first the United Nations, second the United States, now the African Union stepping in to try to find some way of mediating this problem. While these talks were proceeding under the auspices of Ramaphosa, Ethiopia closed the floodgates in July of 2020 and carried out the first filling of the reservoir behind the dam. This was an indication, I think, that the talks were not going to go much of anywhere. And sure enough, by late August of 2020, these African Union-sponsored talks had failed to reach an agreement as well. By November of 2020, fighting had broken out in northern Ethiopia. The central government found itself embroiled in an armed conflict between the central authorities in Addis Ababa and the former government, the former leadership group based in the predominant Tigrayan region of the northern part of the country. And when fighting broke out inside Ethiopia at the end of 2020, all negotiations, all talks, I should say, concerning the Nile River were put on hold. By the end of March 2021, Egypt's President Assisi made an unusually forceful statement. President Assisi had been expressing hopes for negotiation, hopes for a peaceful resolution of the dispute. But in March of 2021, President Assisi commented at a news conference in the city of Suez that, quote, "No one can take a single drop of water from Egypt, and whoever wants to try it, let him try." So Egypt again asserted a forceful position, again asserted a hardline position with regard to the current situation on the ground. This statement set the stage for renewed talks in April of 2021, again hosted by the African Union. Egypt's Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry called these talks of April 2021, quote, "the last chance for a settlement of the dispute, but nothing came of these talks either. In the aftermath of these meetings in the Democratic Republic of Congo, President Assisi 2 times in 1 week warned that, quote, all options are open if any water were, in his words, touched by any outside country. And the story from the spring of 2021 to today is a story of largely fruitless, largely meaningless meetings among the representatives of these 3 countries. Ethiopia undertook its second filling of the reservoir behind the dam in the summer of 2021. The second filling of the dam was substantially larger than the first filling of the dam. But thanks to especially heavy rains in the rainy season of 2021, the amount of water flowing downriver was in fact larger than normal, even with the water being siphoned off behind the dam. The third series of, the third filling of the reservoir was then carried out last summer, in the summer of 2022, and again, rainfall helped to make up any deficit in the amount of water flowing downriver. Meanwhile, Ethiopian engineers have turned on 2 of the electricity generating turbines in the dam. The dam has begun to generate electricity, and the dam is just about to be finished off to have the highest level of concrete poured, perhaps this coming summer. There are 3 developments regarding the dispute that make the dispute harder to manage today, even than it has been in the past. I want to say just a couple of words about these 3 dynamics that I think provide the context for the current situation in the dispute over the Nile River. First, as we all see from reading the newspapers every day, the leadership in Ethiopia, the government in Addis Ababa, has become unstable. The new leadership, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, has fended off the first challenge from the Tigrayan party in the north, but the civil war in Ethiopia continues to grind on, and there are flare-ups in the fighting. The government has not stabilized after the breakaway forces in the north challenged the central authorities. And what we see is that now with civil war raging in Ethiopia, government officials have found it almost impossible to make concessions regarding the Nile River. The Ethiopian authorities cannot make concessions about anything surrounding national sovereignty or national prestige, so long as the conflict is raging inside Ethiopia. Second, and perhaps more important, over the last few years, Sudan has gradually distanced itself from Egypt. When the dispute flared up between 2011 and 2013, Egypt and Sudan largely had the same position regarding the dispute, were largely allied in opposition to steps taken by Ethiopia. But over the past few years, Sudan has gradually pulled away from the Egyptian position, and Sudan has gradually accommodated, made conciliatory moves in the direction of Ethiopia. The government of Sudan has expressed concern that taking a firm, uncompromising line toward Ethiopia will simply stiffen Ethiopia's resistance, that it will be harder to reach any kind of settlement by hanging tough with regard to negotiations. And Sudan seems to have become particularly worried when Egypt started to mobilize the Arab League to deal with the dispute. Egypt has turned to the Arab League for support, has turned to the Arab League for backing in its position over the last couple of years. And the Sudanese government expressed deep concern that mobilizing the Arab League would provoke a belligerent response from Ethiopia. We also see that during the course of this dispute, Sudan has pulled away from Egypt to the point that a dormant territorial dispute between Sudan and Egypt has flared up again. There's a small area of territory along the Red Sea coast, along the border between Sudan and Egypt, whose control has been in some question between the two governments, part of territory that's sometimes called the Halayib Triangle, and the disagreement over permanent control of this territory has flared up as Sudan has drifted in the direction of agreeing with Ethiopia about the importance of the Renaissance Dam and about the benefits that the Renaissance Dam might provide for the region as a whole. So the conflict has become harder to manage, it seems to me, as unity has dissipated between Egypt and Sudan. And third, we see that over the past few years, the dispute over the Nile River has entangled several additional countries. In the good old days, the dispute involved only the three governments of Cairo, Khartoum, and Addis Ababa, and sometimes even only two camps, Egypt, Sudan on one side, Ethiopia on the other side. The conflict now has brought in a number of other actors. The most obvious new actor is South Sudan. Not only is Sudan a Nile riparian country, but now South Sudan is as well. And shortly after it gained independence, South Sudan has proposed that South Sudan might build a couple of dams that might have an impact on the flow of water, on the availability of water flowing downriver into Egypt. So Egypt now has to juggle relations with South Sudan as well as with Ethiopia. Not only South Sudan, but Kenya has become more heavily involved in Nile affairs. Kenya has worked with Ethiopia to integrate the electricity grids of Kenya with Ethiopia. And whatever electrical power is produced at the Renaissance Dam will most likely be distributed to Kenya, be a part of Kenya's development program in future. Even more significant than Kenya has been Uganda's heightened involvement. Uganda sent troops into South Sudan in late 2013 to support the government of South Sudan against its opponents, and Uganda joined Egypt in this effort to prop up the government of South Sudan against its domestic challengers. This set the stage for talks between Egypt and Uganda over security matters, over military cooperation of different kinds, military training, military exercises, back and forth. And Egypt has made it clear that this cooperation over security matters with Uganda is at least partly focused on the water resources of the Nile River. By 2016, when Uganda's foreign minister made his first comprehensive tour of Middle Eastern capitals, the first capital that Uganda's foreign minister visited was Cairo. Uganda has started to be an active player, may well be a key player in the future of the dispute over the Nile River. And last, Egypt has made diplomatic overtures to Eritrea as well. Egypt not only is making efforts to cooperate in security affairs with Eritrea, but also in economic development affairs with Eritrea. Relations with Eritrea have become more complicated as the civil war broke out in Ethiopia. However, the relationship between Eritrean government and the government of Ethiopia has become tangled in a way that I've found hard to keep straight, and certainly has been hard for Egypt to keep straight over the last few months. But what we see in the case of the dispute over the Nile River is that a dispute that not long ago looked relatively straightforward has now become more complex, has involved more actors with more divergences of interest. And not only are more actors involved in the dispute over the Nile, but some of those actors are now involved in civil war. Sudan, South Sudan, and Ethiopia as well have internal problems that may well make this dispute harder to resolve even than it had been in the past. I've talked more than I probably should, but I find this a simply fascinating and important component of international relations in the Middle East today. And I've been intrigued to hear
Thank you.
what thoughts.
Thank you so much. Your expertise in this area truly shone through your presentation. I enjoyed the comprehensive yet concise discussion on the history of the conflict, and we all learned so much. We have so many questions, so I will get to them. We have few on the like the reason why Saudi Arabia interfered. This was also on my mind. Someone is asking, do the Saudis own agricultural land in Ethiopia?
Yes, the short answer is that Saudis have invested in agricultural land in Ethiopia and in Sudan. The Saudi government, you remember, made an experiment at growing wheat and other agricultural products inside the kingdom during the 1990s, but quickly discovered that that was not economically viable. And so Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar have all bought land and made investments in machinery and distribution networks in Ethiopia and Sudan. And the Saudis are worried not only about agricultural production in Ethiopia, but agricultural production in Sudan as well, I think, and are trying to juggle assuaging, mollifying the Ethiopians with making sure that productive farmland in Sudan continues to operate.
Okay, thank you. Why refusal to give advance warning? Has Ethiopia been treated justly by Egypt?
Yeah. The Ethiopian government, to an outsider, looks like it is behaving in a high-handed way, looks like it's behaving in a way that is against the norms of how river development takes place, against the standard practices of dam construction and irrigation construction. And one of the things that worries me when I think about analyzing this dispute is making the Ethiopians look high-handed and unreasonable in their projects. One thing that I noticed that I hadn't realized before is that Ethiopia, even today, 90% of the population of the country does not have access to electricity. So there's no question that Ethiopia needs power generation. There's no question that the dam and other electrical projects are crucial components of Ethiopia's own development. There's also no question that Ethiopia does not feel bound by the existing agreements. I decided not to go into deep history about this, but the distribution of the Nile River waters at the present time is largely governed by a couple of documents, a couple of treaties that were drawn up without Ethiopia's participation. They were drawn up by the British. They were drawn up without taking into consideration Ethiopian interests. So Ethiopia feels like it is not bound by the existing order. Nevertheless, it is worth thinking about why the Ethiopians appear to be so uncompromising, why they appear to be so disdainful of the interests of the downriver countries. Ethiopia must recognize how vital these waters are for Sudan and Egypt, and why Ethiopia is pushing ahead is in some respects hard to understand. Now, Ethiopian engineers insist that the whole dam project, that the whole project can occur without siphoning off water, without damaging the interests of downwater states. We're not really sure that this is true because the outside experts have not been given enough information to determine whether this assertion will hold up. I almost said hold water, but I decided not to. But whether or not this project will actually damage Egypt's interests is something that's not quite clear yet, but certainly the Egyptians are desperately concerned about it.
Thank you for that answer. Another question here, why is it so difficult to find any news about the dam and the conflict here in the US?
It is hard to find news about the dam. I have been relying more than I probably should on a news source that's coming out of Washington, that's been coming out for the last few years, called almonitor.com, AL-MONITOR.com, almonitor.com. Almonitor.com seems to rely on journalists and reporters based in the region, writing about a range of topics that don't get covered very well at all in mainstream press in the West. And there's a couple of reporters based in Egypt that have written detailed accounts of what's going on with regard to this dispute on a more or less regular basis. The reports for the last 3 years are a little repetitive, they're a little dull, because they are reports of meetings that drag on or they cover the same ground over and over again. But yet, these are reports that keep up with what is happening. And I'm not sure why the mainstream press doesn't pay a little more attention. I'm trying to remember, I think not too long ago, meaning within the last 2 years, the New York Times did have a long story, but one story every 2 years doesn't count as very good coverage.
Okay, why has the Sudan government taken so little interest in the impact of the Ethiopian dam?
Boy, there does seem to be a big change taking place in Sudanese policy right at the moment. And it's been a little hard for me to tease out exactly what's going on in the last few months, but the Sudanese government aligned itself with Egypt, was a major player in the negotiations, was deeply involved in the dispute during the years 2000 13, 14, 15, up to the time of the Declaration of Principles. After that time, the Sudanese government started to back off a little bit, started to put some distance between itself and Egypt, but started to take a more, let's call it even-handed, perhaps, position regarding the dispute, started to take into consideration the points that the Ethiopian government was making. And since the change of government in Khartoum, what's it been now, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, the new leadership in Khartoum seems to be following the Ethiopian government's lead to an unexpected degree, almost abandoning the position that Sudan had held before, forming a kind of partnership with Ethiopia, talking about the benefits to the region that can come from regulating Nile River water more invasively, the benefits of more electricity being available for the region as a whole, the way that the Grand Renaissance Dam can benefit the region. Sudan seems to be paying much more attention to the benefits that might come from this project rather than the possible dangers that might accrue. So Sudan has changed its position quite remarkably very recently.
Thank you. Catherine Bart asks, Ethiopia is a very mountainous country. Where specifically in Ethiopia will be the proposed irrigation waters be channeled, and how many new hectares of agricultural land are involved?
Thank you. I should have prepared some sort of map, and it's a failure on my part that I didn't provide long-suffering audience with some visual aid to help with this discussion. The Blue Nile River is in the northern part of Ethiopia. It is not where most of the fighting has taken place in the current civil war. The Blue Nile, it comes out of, let's call it, the northwestern part of Ethiopia rather than the directly northern part of Ethiopia. And the Blue Nile River then winds up into the mountains, into highlands that are remarkably productive in terms of rain, remarkably productive in terms of water supply for the region as a whole. There's a Dutch scholar who writes about Northeast Africa that has called Ethiopia the water tower of Africa, that it's where water is produced, where water is stored, where the water comes from that irrigates the whole of the surrounding area. Now, I've got to tell you, regarding the agricultural part of the Millennium Project, I do find it remarkable that that component of the Millennium Project has pretty much dropped out of sight. This is a way of saying that I can't answer the question very well. But the irrigation part of the project seems to be taking a back seat. It's never reported on. Perhaps it's reported on in Ethiopian sources that I have not seen, but I don't know how far along the project is. I can't answer how large the agricultural project is, but I mentioned it in order to say that however large the agricultural component is, that will involve a different management problem for the Nile River water. That the Ethiopian government has been insisting that it will not siphon off any water, it will just delay the flow of water going downriver. But to the extent that water is actually used for irrigation and that it's actually kept inside Ethiopia, that will indeed change the amount of water that's available. So I apologize, I do not know exactly how large this irrigation scheme is. If it's anything like the scale of the project of the dam, it may well be sizable.
Okay, we have so many questions that we have time for, so I have to skip around and ask different questions here. Is there any indication that Egypt has either instigated or supported the insurgency in Ethiopia?
The Ethiopian government has claimed on a number of occasions that Egypt is supporting, is instigating opposition movements and critical commentary inside Ethiopia as part of the bargaining over the Nile River dispute. And the Ethiopian government has said this on a couple of occasions. I have not seen any evidence. I've not seen any clear sign that this is true. It's a claim that the Ethiopians have made. The Ethiopian government has engaged in armed clashes along the border with Sudan in the last couple of years. And so even though the Egyptian authorities are too far away to play much of a part in internal conflict in Ethiopia, there is a real chance that the Sudanese armed forces might have an impact on fighting on the ground in Ethiopia.
Okay, speaking of interference, Professor Donald Reed is here and he has a question. Hi, Professor Reed. His question is, has China gotten involved in the dispute in any way?
Good for you, Professor Reed. Dead right. Just recently, China has gotten itself involved. It has made a proposal to act as mediator. It has proposed to Ethiopia that it might be willing to play a part. As you may remember, there are long-standing connections between China and Ethiopia. There's a long-time economic connection, a long-time diplomatic connection between Beijing and Addis Ababa. In some respects, it's surprising that the Chinese have not been involved before now. Partly, I think China has not been invited in to be a mediator because China was connected to the old Marxist-Leninist government, the radical government of Ethiopia in the bad old days. And so more recent governments of Ethiopia have broken their connection with China. But yes, the Chinese have proposed to act as mediators. The Egyptians do not seem terribly interested in having China act as mediators. The Egyptians have at least exchanged pleasantries with Russia to step in as be mediators. The Egyptians are very much thrashing around at the moment, trying to find anyone who might be able to give some traction to actual discussions.
Fabulous. What is the effect of the dam on the biodiversity of fish in the River Nile? Can this be avoided in any way? For example, I've been looking for a fish called elephant fish that has once existed in the River Nile, but I guess it's no longer there.
My goodness. That's
very specific.
Interesting question. Wow, great audience. I'm sorry, I sure don't know. The essays that I've read about the impact on the river are entirely about water rather than biodiversity. It shows my the lack of my preparation. Sorry, I don't know.
We have so many other questions. Do you, Professor Lawson, have time to extend? It's 3 o'clock. That's the time we end our lecture. But if you're if you don't mind, do you want to answer a question or can send it
sure.
to you?
Yes,
I'd be
glad to keep. Yes, I'd be glad
to. Thank you. Thank you. Will you give a talk on the environmental impacts of Egypt's Aswan Dam?
Of Egypt's Aswan Dam.
Mm-hmm.
I'm at the pleasure of ARCE. Honestly, that would be a long way outside my expertise. I'm trying hard right now to think if I can recommend anything
I
that
think
would be.
it's I think it's published. I just read some
Okay.
books about it, even like in the I think Leila Ahmed's book. Her dad used to work as an engineer, and he was against the building the Aswan Dam, I think, and she wrote about it for a little
No
bit.
kidding. Thank you.
Yeah.
From an historical perspective, we should remember Alan Mikhail's work. Alan, writing about the Ottoman period, has talked extensively about ecological history and the importance of ecology and environment, I should say, environmental history, as a way of supplementing the usual story of governors and tax preparation and so on, as a way of understanding Ottoman Egypt.
Thank you. 2 questions here about your vision for the future based on your high expertise. What do you think would be the fairest solution for all the countries involved?
Oh, I got this far. You mean I got? I stayed too long. The intriguing thing, there's a bunch of intriguing things about conflicts over water. Scholars of international relations have paid a good deal of attention to water conflicts over time and water conflicts in different parts of the world. And one, let's call it hopeful, thing that these studies have shown is that if we look at all of the disputes and all of the potential dangerous conflicts that might arise over water, there is no evidence that disputes over water lead to actual wars between countries. If we look statistically, look at the quantitative evidence, we find that disputes over water tend to be resolved eventually in some fashion rather than military conflict. Now, I'm particularly intrigued by this because 5 years ago, I might have expected that the dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia had at least a chance of erupting into armed conflict. But here we are 5 years down the road, and sure enough, Ethiopia has been intransigent. Ethiopia has, in some respects, thumbed its nose at the downriver countries. And Ethiopia has behaved provocatively in a number of ways, and yet armed conflict has not resulted. So there does seem to be something about conflicts over water that do not provoke armed struggle. Now, if that's true, then what pressure can Egypt apply? What kind of leverage does Egypt have in this situation? Well, it doesn't have much leverage. And just over the last year or so, I've been reading reports about the Egyptian government pumping money, another bad pun, pumping money into groundwater conservation and not desalinization, but water purification projects and ways of expanding the water supply of Egypt besides the Nile River. In some ways, we see Egypt adjusting itself to the new situation. So Egypt at the moment is caught between strategies. Egypt is going to have to accept the current situation and find alternative ways of growing wheat, which seems almost impossible at this point, versus continuing with these fruitless negotiations. And so I think the Egyptian authorities may be looking down the road and deciding that some kind of alternative technical solutions to finding more water is the way forward.
Okay, Thank you. Have any suggestions been made by neutral countries or other agents that seem fair to all countries involved? Do you have any suggestion as to how the situation could be approached and resolved fairly? You kind of answered that a little bit.
No, but that's a good elaboration, I think. So far, as near as I can tell, the agencies that have acted as mediators have not made proposals of their own. I don't think even the United States made proposals of its own. They've acted more, the outside mediators, the UN and the African Union, have more tried to get the participants in the same room rather than making suggestions for what the participants should do when they are in the room. And so at the moment, we don't really have alternative proposals. We have the countries themselves expected to come up with proposals. I apologize, I just lost my train of thought. I was going to say something. Sorry.
That's okay. We have similar questions, so maybe you'll recover the train of thought. There is an old agreement according to which Egypt gets the lion's share of Nile water. As the other states develop, it's logical they will demand larger shares. Does Joey, I don't know the spelling, have any strategy for dealing with the predictable development? Does GOE, I think it's abbreviation for something I don't know.
No, thank you. Please forgive me. I do remember what I was going to say about the use of the word fair in this situation. It turns out that's a tricky term. I mean, it turns out that the fair use of the water, an equitable use of water, is a dangerous use of language from an Egyptian perspective. From the Egyptian perspective, what matters is the historic distribution of water, the way water has always been distributed and the way water is expected to be distributed in the future. And if Egypt is really getting 2/3 of the water of the Nile River, in many respects, that could be called unfair. And so any proposal to have a more equitable distribution or a more fair distribution of Nile River water would count as a change in the status quo. So the Egyptians have always rejected the use of the term fair. And in international water law, in the way water is allocated among countries, this use of the word fair turns out to be a very problematic term, a very ambiguous term that a lot of negotiations hinge on. The Ethiopian government is, of course, pushing for a fair use of water. But a fair use of water would be one in which Ethiopia obtains much more water than it has ever used before. In many respects, the current arrangement for distributing Nile River water assumes that Ethiopia uses none of it, which is, of course, a myth. It's, of course, not at all true that Ethiopia uses no water from the Blue Nile, but nevertheless, that's the fiction that drives the current arrangement. And to get to the second question, sure enough, as Ethiopia develops industry and agriculture, as South Sudan develops industry and agriculture, as Uganda does, all of these countries will start using water to an extent that they have not done so before, and will make demands on the river that the river might not be able to handle. And the $64,000 question is, at what point water, so much water gets siphoned off that it affects Lake Nasser, it affects power generation at the dam at Aswan, it affects the way that water is necessary for livelihood inside Egypt. But you're quite right that the current distribution of water is a kind of myth. And it is, after all, much like the way that the United States of America deals with the water of the Colorado River basin in the West. I mean, the Colorado River basin operates on a kind of myth that Nevada uses no water. And of course, that was true before Las Vegas was built, but now Nevada uses all kinds of water, and there's no water left in the Colorado River basin. And the question is, will the Nile River head in that direction?
Thank you. Interesting comment about fair use here. BJ Smith asks, this might be a bit of out of the scope of this lecture, but in international conflicts, it is said that one must always follow the money to help understand, as well as understand the national interest. Can you comment at all where money is coming from, external sources, to militate the situations in Ethiopia, Sudan, and peripheral countries?
Well, things have changed in Ethiopia after the fighting has broken out and after various challenges to the central government. But in the beginning, and by in the beginning, I mean 2011, in 2011, 2012, when the Millennium Dam was being proposed, one of the responses Egypt had was to go to the lending agencies and the development assistance agencies that Ethiopia had approached, and Egypt tried to persuade outside funders to provide the money to build the dam. And in order to not be pressured by outside funders, the Ethiopian government turned its back on outside funding and announced that the dam would be funded with completely internal sources, that the Ethiopian people, the Ethiopian nation, would build this dam on its own. This was a project of the national character and would not rely on outside funding. In some respects, that's a brilliant stroke because it removed Egypt's capability to put pressure on Ethiopia through outside funding. And as far as I know, Ethiopia has stuck with that position. And Ethiopia has indeed funded the project using internal money. And it hired outside contractors, especially an Italian contractor. And the Egyptians have tried hard to put pressure on the Italian government to interfere in the project. But in terms of funding and financing, the Ethiopians seem to make this an internal project.
Thank you. One last question. There are many similar international river flow management disputes. For example, the Tigris and Euphrates, or even the Colorado River in the US. Do you think that the UN, for example, has kept hands off because legal principles established or imposed in one region can affect the legal principles claimed vis-a-vis other such disputes? Thank you. Excellent talk.
Terrific question, and it may well be time for the international, I don't much care for this term international community, but it may be time for some international agency to take a good look at the situation around the world. I've been paying some attention to relations between Iran and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan recently, and Iran finds itself in the same position, with Afghanistan having built 2 big new dams across the Helmand River, and Iran is desperate for water in the eastern provinces of Iran. There's a major project in Uzbekistan with Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. There's the problem of water in Pakistan being disrupted, coming in. So there are important rivers, major water sources around the world where this problem is arising, where this problem is becoming more explosive than it had been in the past. And it does look to me as a non-lawyer and non-specialist that the existing water laws are not going to be able to handle these problems. This may not be a legal problem. As the question implies, there's a problem of sovereignty taking shape, and the United Nations is built on the principle of sovereignty, of non-interference in domestic affairs. And so as long as water is considered a problem of sovereignty, the United Nations will not be the right agency to deal with cross-border problems like the problem of water distribution. And whether or not some other international multilateral agency could be created is a very open question. It sure looks like multilateral agencies are facing hard times in the contemporary international arena.
Thank you so much, Professor Lawson, for such an important talk, much needed. And thank you for your dedication and effort in making such a complex topic accessible and engaging. Thank you, everyone who attended, all 180 of you who joined us today, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thank you.
Wonderful, Fatma. Thank you so much. Real pleasure.
Thank you.